speak.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we
Yes.
can hear you.
You can. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I was saying that this is a special session for more than one reason. One reason, of course, is that when the author himself can come and talk to us and tell us about his own book, it is a very wonderful situation indeed. The other is that it is about the history of our country that I know that we're all very curious about. What was India like before the British came? I mentioned Shashi Tharoor, and he very famously has commentaries and books about what the British did to India. Well, today's book is a glimpse of what India was like before British started governing the country. So we are very proud and very happy to welcome a little bit about Uday, and then I hope he will tell us more about himself. He's from AFMC. He's a practicing surgeon in Pune. He's from the Navy. And clearly, he has managed to find time. Really, I don't know how, because the life of a doctor is so busy, as we all know. But he has found time to nurture his his interest in history. And he has brought out 5 books in the last 9 years. So I think that's a huge accomplishment for which you ought to be congratulated. Now, Uday, over to you. And before you start talking about the book, just tell us a little about yourself. How come this interest in history? Did you come to write these books? We'd love to know about it.
He hasn't. The one thing has not been said there. Uday has been an activist, a green activist, along with us, and he used to come for every meeting with that. So he and I go 20 years of activism together. And Uday, another thing, my father joined RAMC in 1940. And he continued till 1969 or 70, I think. I'm not sure. Okay, Uday, go ahead and talk. And others, please switch off. Thank you.
Thank you, Satish and Mohini, for this opportunity to speak about my book and for this introduction. I don't want to spend too much time over myself. I was born in Pune. I was in the school not far from where you people are living, in National Model School. That time it was located in the Aga Khan Palace. I was a boarding student, stayed there for 7 years in that place. And Principal Nagarwala was the principal at those days. After that, I joined AFMC, and then I joined the Indian Navy, served there, retired, came back to Pune. And I always had a passion for history. Probably my grandfather, my mother's father, was interested. He was a teacher of history, and he had a lot of books in his library. And so I used to read them from childhood. And actually in school, when I was in the hostel, I remember I wrote a book in Marathi about the Mughal and the Maratha period, and I still have that notebook with me. So that thing was there. And then after you finish your SSC, you start getting involved in your medical admission and your medical practice and your post-graduation. So though you do your additional reading in that field, you really don't, you can't be serious about it till about 2009 or 10, when I used to be very, I didn't like the way some parts of our history were projected or ignored, whichever way you want to take it. So I first thought and it was the 250th year of the Battle of Panipat, which was in 1761, and 2011 was the 250th anniversary. So I thought I'll write a monograph on that, which eventually became a book. And that's how the first book came out, which was ultimately, I just published it from my own resources. I didn't go to any publisher because that would have delayed it. I didn't know anybody also in the publishing industry. And I said that's it. I mean, if my money goes, it just goes waste. And fortunately, it's in the 5th reprint now, and there are 4 more books have followed. Some have got translated also. So obviously, people are, that's encouraging. I mean, you feel like writing when people are buying your books and giving you good feedback. So that's what set me off on this. I was a consultant in KM Hospital for about 15 years. I was also a postgraduate teacher. I did all that till about 2015. In 2015, I left institutional practice, and I continued my own private practice as a freelancing surgeon. So that's where I am, and this is going on to this day. So I think we can manage both things. You just have to stop seeing these TV serials which take away a lot of your time. So, so anyway, coming to the topic, topic of the day, which is James Whale's And this is the book in case you people haven't seen it. And these are the paintings which were done by James Wales. So actually, it's a story. It's a story of an artist named James Wales, a Scotsman who came to India and spent 4 years here. And customarily, in journalism, you tell your story with the 4 Ws and 1 H. But when you write a book, you can't do that because you can't tell the whole story in the first paragraph. It has to come, and you have to keep the reader interested. So I'm going to tell you the story as it actually happened. And so let's start with the slideshow so that you don't have to keep looking at me all the time, and it'll make things a little more interesting. So this is the cover of the book, as you can see. And actually, this man, James Wales, was born. He was born in Aberdeen, in a place called Peterhead, in 1747, and he was a struggling painter. As long as he was there, he was a landscape artist to start with, and then he moved on to drawing portraits and so on. But he was always hard up, and money was always a problem. And in fact, in the Edinburgh archives, I found some papers which show that because he could not pay his bills and his rent, he had to be evicted from there. All his belongings were actually auctioned. And there are even some papers which show that the auction yielded an amount of some 11 pounds and 10 shillings and 7.5 pence, which was all taken away. It included a fiddle and some old paintings, some canvas which he had drawn. So he lost everything over there in 1777. As you can see the date, it was taken from his apartment. And after that, he probably left Scotland and he came down to London because that was where the action was as far as the art scene is concerned. And there he also began to move on from landscape to portrait painting. Now in London, in around 1753, he was only 36 years of age of that time, which at that time in those days was a fairly advanced age to make your fortune. And at that point in time, he met one man called James Forbes, who came back from India for a break in England. And along with him, he brought some pictures of the Elephanta caves and of a huge banyan tree which he had encountered here. James Forbes, in fact, has written a beautiful book called Oriental Memoirs, little early part of the 19th century. So he spent a long time in India. And then he got those pictures, which he had sketches actually redrawn by James Wales, and he probably spoke about India to James Wales. And that is when James Wales decided that his future actually lay in coming to India. And that's when he started applying to the East India Company that please give me a ship. I would like to go to India and I would like to draw pictures and painting, because that is where the money was. And a lot of enterprising people from England those days used to come here to make their fortune actually. So as an artist, as a painter, an explorer, and an antiquarian, actually archaeology as a word was not even used in those days. The antiquarian, or the early archaeologist, he actually jotted, when he came to India, he jotted down his observations in the form of journals. There are journals of 1792, 93, 94 that way. And he drew a lot of pictures, not only he, even his assistants. And all these together is what I had to use to really make this book. And though he did a lot of work in those 3 or 4 years that he spent here, his name you don't get that instant recall when you hear his name, because unlike the other British artists who went to Calcutta, which was the capital of the British establishment, he came to Bombay, which is a much smaller capital city, a much smaller place. And so he came there in 1790, left London in January 1791, and in July 1791, he had reached Bombay. Now, at that time, you find that the Maratha Empire was in its heyday, because it was practically spread all over the place, and the capital was Pune, which was the place where the Peshwa was established. In the north, there were the Scindias and the Holkars. In Gujarat, there were the Gaikwads. In Nagpur, there were the Bhosles. And practically, except for eastern India and parts of the Madras Presidency, you find that the Maratha Empire had spread out all over the place. And Charles Mallet was the resident, Sir Charles Mallet, who was the resident in Pune, the British resident. He actually was instrumental in getting the Marathas on board to fight unitedly against Tipu Sultan in 1790. And in fact, I will come to that a little later because he's drawn a beautiful picture which commemorates that treaty. And this man was the man who actually was instrumental in getting James Wales to Pune, because when James Wales went to Bombay initially, what he did was he was just spending time getting whatever commissions he can get. He was trying to draw pictures of the Englishmen over there, and he was trying to get the portraits of children and families of Englishmen who were sitting there. He drew his famous 12 views of Bombay at that point in time, which are all available now. Some of them are public, put some of them in the book also. For example, this is a picture which he drew at that time of the Sion, from the Sion Fort. And you can see the attention to detail at that point in time, that you find a man over here who is lost an arm and a leg, and you can see he's walking with the help of a wooden leg. And of course you can see the English man who's in charge of the fort with his big belly coming down the steps, and you can see the open space around here, which was Sion of those days. So there are such 12 such views of Bombay which you draw. And in fact, about a year back, in Bombay, there is a gentleman named Bharat Gothoskar who runs a place called Khaki Lab, and he actually went to these 12 places and he took pictures of what this place looks like now. So then and now, he put those 12 pictures in. It's got a place opposite in Fort, and he actually had those paintings put next to each other, the 12 views and the present views of that time. So it's a very interesting way to go back to the history of Bombay and old Bombayites. Anybody here will definitely enjoy that kind of view. Then you find that in 1770, the island of Sashti, or Salsette as it was called in those days, which extends from Bandra to Bhayandar, that is the island, and Thana. So this is the whole island of Sashti, was acquired by the British. And a lot of caves, in fact, if you see Maharashtra by itself, it has almost 80% of the caves in India, because the basalt rock which you have here, it facilitates this. And the island of Salsette itself has a lot of caves. So it is after the acquisition of Salsette that a lot of these English officers who were in the Bombay area, they started going down there, and Kanheri caves were explored, and the Jogeshwari caves were explored, the Mandapeshwar caves near Borivali were explored, and they found the Exar hero stones which are there, which are today again near Borivali. So that is what, is there a problem with the volume? So that is what was going on at that time. And all these places in this first year, we find that James Wales has visited, including Elephanta. And he in fact writes that I've been in Elephanta for 2 weeks, and I don't think anybody else has been here for that long. Now, in this year, 1791, is when actually he happened to meet Charles Mallet, who was in Bombay for one of the periodical visits there. And that is when he met him, and Mallet was, of course, impressed by Wales' paintings, and he asked him that, would you be interested in coming down to Pune, because that is where the money is. And the nobility was of the Marathas were those days in Pune. So he asked Wales. Wales was very excited with the idea, and Mallet managed to engineer an invitation from the Pune government for James Wales to come down to Pune. And that is how Savai Madhavrao was the Peshwa at that time. Nana Fadnis was the regent of the empire. So he got an invitation from them, and in the beginning of monsoon, sometimes the end, his diary actually begins with the journey which starts from Bombay and comes to Pune. Now, it's a very interesting story of how he traveled in those days. And his diary tells you an account of the time he left from Mazgon, because that was a place from the boat used to leave. It went past Elephanta and reached Belapur, where they stayed for the night. At Belapur, they used to employ people to carry their luggage. And there used to be a big caravan of people carrying their luggage, and the palanquins in which these people used to sit and travel. And because the beginning of rains, there was a lot of slush on the road. It was difficult to make too much of progress. And right up to Khopoli, you find practically the same Pune-Bombay road which you have today. You find him going to Panvel, you find him going to the place called Chowk, and then you find him coming for the night halt at Khopoli. And he is given a wonderful description of Khopoli of those days, that what kind of a village it was, what kind of people lived there. And then he describes a temple called, you can see it today, it's a temple called Vireshwar Temple, which is when you go by the old Bombay Pune Ghat, just as you begin climbing that ghat, on the left there's a road going down, where there's a huge water tank, about 1200 feet in diameter. And that was built around 1756 by Nana Fadnes's father. And there's a temple next to that of Vireshwar, where the tank is still being used to supply water to Khopoli. And looking at this temple and this tank, he thought the village will be very, very nice. But then he found that there are mean dwellings there. And then he's got some choice remarks about the people and their mentality of the people living there, which I think they're those caustic comments they're best read from the original. And so from there, climbing of the Bor Ghat, which in those days there was no road, it was a walking track. On the way, he again describes it was beautiful, green, the waterfalls, the rains that started, and he found a cave on the way there also. So he kept traveling, came to Khopoli and Khandala, and Khandala was the first chowki where he was stopped and a passport was sought from him. That if you want to go any further, you have to give us a passport. So he had to show all the passes which he had got, and from then he could proceed. Now, unlike the present road to Pune, which comes via Talegaon, in those days the road which was followed was the road from Khandala. When you leave, he goes behind the fort of Lohargarh. Now, on your expressway, when you go and you're coming from Lonavala to Pune, you find the fort of Lohargarh and Bisapur on your right. Instead of that, James Wales went behind the fort of Lohargarh, where you have those Bedsa caves. So he went by that road, and passing by the forts of Tung and Tikona, he came to a village called Ambegaon. Now, this Ambegaon was an Inam village of Nana Fadnes. Today, the old Ambegaon has been submerged in the Pauna Dam, and there's a new Ambegaon on the banks of that dam. So he went to Ambegaon. He describes the people there, how he was received, where he stayed. From there, he went to a small pass in the hills called Dorn village. Now, I found it was very difficult to find it on the map. And even today, the Dorn village has got a small ghat between two hills, which is got a Kacha road. It still doesn't have a Pakka road because that road has been abandoned now. Nobody travels from Khandala to Pune using that road. And then he came down to Wakad. He mentions the name Wakad, where again there's a temple, and he describes how the people there were and so on. And then 8 miles from Pune, before that he had crossed the Pavna river. Of course, he said it was neck deep water, waist deep water, and he managed to cross it at one point where they knew there's a crossing. But when he came to Mura, that river was in flood and there was no bridge there. And he expresses astonishment that we are just 8 miles from the capital of the Maratha Empire. And here is this big river flowing, and there is no bridge or there are no boats to cross it. And here he describes a very peculiar method of crossing the rivers, which he had never encountered before in his life, which is that a lot of calabashes, which are kind of dried pumpkins, they're all strapped together. And on top of that, the luggage on top of that. And then the passengers sat around. And you can see people swimming around these calabashes which are placed there. And one by one, these 3 so-called improvised boats are seen crossing the river. So now James Wales doesn't leave his own picture behind. He has drawn so many pictures and so many sketches, but we don't have a picture of James Wales. This particular picture was drawn by an assistant of his. And we can only assume that probably it was James Wales traveling, crossing the river when this picture was drawn. So this is the only possible picture we have of James Wales at that point. From there he came to Pune, and there he finally reached the residency of the resident, Charles Mallet. He describes the buildings there, the cottages there, the elephants, the camels. Mallet took him on a full tour of the place, and residency was where today the district judge's bungalow is, and on the Sangam. And it extended right up to the Sangamwadi new bridge, including the engineering college grounds on both sides of the road. So that entire thing was given to the resident to build his cottages, and his entire establishment, his servants, everybody used to live there. He also describes the dargah which was at that point in time, which which you can still see there. So all this description you get from his book. And within a day or two of his arrival there, Mahatji Scindia had just come back from the north to Pune, and there's a visit of Mahatji Scindia to the camp of Charles Mallet. And he gives a big description of how we went out to receive the great man, and what are the kind of people who are accompanying him. Mahatji Scindia, as everybody knows, was injured when he was returning from Panipat, and after that he was lame. I mean, he could not walk on his own. So he describes how two people had to support him and bring him to the place where he finally sat down. So all those descriptions. Then after sitting there, his son was sitting next to him, and what kind of ornaments they were wearing. Charles Mallet, how he received them. He went down on one knee and presented them with a rose diamond, and then they gave him some gifts in exchange. There was a celebration. A lot of dancing girls were there for his entertainment, which you can see over here. This is the sketch of Scindia sitting here, his son sitting next to him, all the English officers sitting next to that on this side, dancing girls at this end, and his entire army which came along with him sitting here. So this is a rough sketch he draws in his journal. And again, he writes about the dancing girls that they are paid so well. They are paid about 15,000 rupees a year and so on. So all these minor details you get from his book. So this is the kind of a person, very observant and very small details wouldn't escape his attention. That kind of a person who came here. He describes the floods which took place when he was in the residency. He measures the depth of water, that when they rain for 3 days, what kind of depth the water reaches. And the water enters the residency, and the snakes and rats come out of there and enter the buildings of the residency. So all these things you find are described in his book. Then the next item on the agenda was to meet the people who had invited him there, which was basically Nana Fadnis and the Peshwa, Savai Madhav. So initially with Charles Mallet, again they went in a very ceremonial fashion, because Charles Mallet was very particular that the prestige of the British was always visible, and therefore he had the biggest elephants, he had horses going in front of him, and it was actually in state that they would go from their residency to meet the Peshwa or to meet Nana. Now this is a picture of the hall in today's Nanavada, which is on the first floor. And he describes how he went to meet Nana in a narrow staircase. In those days, the walls used to be so thick, and in between those walls used to have a narrow staircase, rather steep staircase, which used to go on the upper story. So he goes there, he meets Nana, and he gives his personal impressions about what kind of a person he is. They embrace when they go there at first. Then they have some kind of formal talk. He asks him how was your journey and things of that sort. And then while they decide to go to the Shaniwar Wada, they give him beetle leaves for his departure, and they both go and meet the Peshwa in the Shaniwar Wada, where again a description is given of their meeting over there. So all these things you find are described in his journal, and how he spent time there and so on. And then you come to the spot that he has to now. He has met Nana Fadnis, he has met the Peshwa. The next item on the agenda is to prove to them that he is a good artist, without which he will not get commission to draw their paintings. So to get towards that, he has to first show them some paintings that he has already made. Now, he had not carried his paintings from Bombay probably with him, because he had commissioned, there were commissions, he gave them back to the people who had ordered them. So there was a Persian translator, come representative of the Bombay government in Pune at that time. His name was Syed Nuruddin Hussain Khan. And he found that he was a very good subject for a portrait. So he asked Khan Sahab, can I draw your can I paint you? And he finally agreed. So the first painting which you find James Wales making was of this person, who in his diary he mentions as Khan Sahab. So for a long time I didn't catch on what he meant by Khan Sahab, because Khan and Khan, you can't kind of correlate these two words. And then later on he's talking about Nuruddin Hassan Khan. And this picture was, which was available to me, because the original picture was not traceable for a very long time. This picture was printed 100 years back, and this is what I was planning to use in my book. But I kept searching for the original because the original picture would always make a lot of difference. When I got a message from another art historian who was in Yale that time, and she told me that the picture has emerged, by which she meant that the picture has been put up for auction at Bonhams in London, and the picture all these years was with the royal family of Jordan. And there was a death in the family, and the person who held that painting, the person who inherited the painting, thought that it's better to sell it off. So probably it had been with that family for quite some time, because I think this picture was sent to the Nizam of Hyderabad, from where probably it went to Jordan's royal family or whatever. And this picture came up for auction just a month before my book was to be published. The problem was to get this picture from Bonhams, because obviously they're not going to just part with a high resolution image of this. So then I wrote to the curators there that I have every picture needs a provenance key. When was it painted, and who drew it, what are the dates on which it was made, and so on and so forth, which I had found in his diaries. Now these diaries, actually, that's another story, because the diaries were never typed and printed by anybody before this. These were part of the Mallet's family collection, which were taken over by a philanthropist called Paul Mellon, who gave them to the Yale University in the Yale Center for British Art. And for the last several decades, they've been just lying there. So when I started working on James Wales, I asked them that, can I have those manuscripts which you have? So they said they have not been digitized, but please come back in 6 months. 6 months later, they had been digitized. So they sent me huge images of each page, each page of 73 MB, which in our dial-up network in those days I could not download. Finally, over a week, gradually I got those 300-400 pages downloaded. And there you found that he has written on which day he started drawing this picture, which day he finished it. So I sent all this information to Bonhams in the hope that now they will give me this picture. And sure enough, the very next day, the picture was in my inbox. And this was the picture which they sent me. And you can see the detail of this picture and how beautifully every strand of his beard or every fold of his shawl, if you zoom in into the shawl, you can get that kind of an impression that was made. And it's a very well preserved specimen of James Wales' picture. The reserve price, I remember at that time, was some 50,000 pounds, 50 to 70,000 pounds. And eventually it was sold for almost 5 times the amount. It was 250,000 pounds was the final auction price for this painting. Of course, again, it has disappeared because the new owner is again not known. And so it emerged only for that 1 month when I could manage to get that high resolution picture from Bonham. So that was a very interesting experience to get these, because the pictures were spread out all over the world, and I had to keep approaching different libraries and people to get them together. So this was one experience which I thought was worth relating. After that, when he came to Pune, one of the things which you find European visitors always are impressed with are the ritual of sati, which they always are, however ghastly it may be, they are always impressed by that. And Wales could not avoid seeing it because it was going on right at the Sangam. I mean, the residency, when he sat in the residency right up across the river, he could see the sati, he drew a picture of that. And that is not the only, he went and attended 3 different sati ceremonies of 3 different kinds of people from different castes, and he used to find out what the background of the family is and so on. Once he went even on the elephant near the present day Lakdi Pool, where there was a cremation ground there. So he went on the elephant because he wanted to get a view from the top above the crowds to see what actually happens in the place where the funeral pyre is lit and so on. And that he not only described, which is unusual. So you find that he, I'll just show you that picture. So this is a picture which you find in opposite the residency, where you have those across Sangam Pool. If you go today, you'll find a temple there and on the riverside. So this is the slope of the river where the sati was usually carried out. And he describes what all happens at that time over here in his handwriting below. And he also draws a rough sketch of what is the position of the dead body and the lady who was going sati and so on. on the funeral pyre and so on over here. Now this picture has got a lot of detail in it, which I'll just show in the next slide, a few more details so you know that all kinds of people came to see the sati, including children. So you see in this first slide, you see the dead bodies being washed in the river. This lady is supposed to go sati. There are a lot of people blowing trumpets. There should be a lot of elephants and camels. This is a funeral pyre which has been set up here. Here you find children in arms. Here you find another child with his mother standing there and watching all these things. So it gives you an impression that this was an occasion which later on there was a lady in the residency, and that lady wanted to go sati because she was the wife of a sepoy. And though Mallet and Wales tried their best to dissuade her, they said that please don't do this. You don't have to go sati. It was not a compulsion, but that lady wanted to do it voluntarily. And the reason she gives is that this brings a lot of prestige to my family. And not only that, that whole day I'm taken in a big procession. There are a lot of people going band baja around me and so on. So it was an argument for over 2 hours, which they finally managed to dissuade her and prevent her from going sati. So there's another episode which he describes in his diary. So these kind of insights into the social life of the times and what kind of customs we had, all that we get. Then again, you find that his wife he had left behind in England with his daughters. So he writes letters to his wife that I'm now painting for the princes of the empire in India, and I'm earning well. So why don't you come here with your with the 2 daughters, and we have got a nice house here and so on. But in the letter, he also describes to her what is the care to be taken while traveling in the ship. For example, one of the things he tells her is that you should not allow strange men to enter your cabin or your daughter's cabin. So that is one human trait that has not changed a lot in the last 250 years. So then again, he didn't do all his paintings himself. He wanted to employ people under him. And one person he had employed in Bombay itself, and that was Robert Mebon. And the other person was an Indian artist from Pune. His name was Gangaram Tambat. Because Gangaram Tambat had been with Charles Mallet even before James Wales got there. And here is a painting of Gangaram Tambat, the self-portrait which he has drawn with his guru. Now this guru was staying somewhere near Ahmednagar. So you find Gangaram sitting opposite his guru. So you get Gangaram's picture as well as that of his guru of those days. So this is one picture which Gangaram has drawn. And again, there's these are martial sports which were carried out in Pune those days. So he's drawn a picture of that. Here he has shown in the middle a Parsi priest of that time. Then he has shown a lady in her in a Nauwari dress, in a Sikh Sawar sari, which we thought is a modern thing, but looks like it existed even in the 18th century because these sketches are of that time. Then you have another. Pune was a very cosmopolitan city even in those days because being the capital of an empire, you had people coming here from all over the place for employment. And you had a lot of Arab mercenaries in the Maratha armies those days. So here you find an Arab carrying a gun on his shoulder and on a horse. Here you find a fakir, who's Mohammedan fakir is the label given here. These are all musical instruments which were being used like in Nagar Khana on top of Shanwarwada. These are the musical instruments which must have been used at that point in time. So from these kind of sketches, you get an idea of the prevailing. Now this is a picture of Parvati which is drawn from Parvati village side. It's not from the side of the Sarasbagh. You can see the way to go up the hill. And the small enclosure you see at the bottom with the temple at the center was the Ramana. And the Ramana was the place where this Dakshina was held every month of Shravan. And even today you have a Ramana Ganpati temple in that area, which you can see, which is of course not the same old one, probably rebuilt. And in the foreground, you find Gangaram Tambat again with his own self-portrait, sitting with a canvas, and he's drawing this painting of Parvati at that point in time. And you can see a small bridge here because this is the Ambi Loda which goes from this point. So there's a small bridge also which is drawn here. So these kind of pictures you find that he has drawn at that time. And gradually as he started, he finished his painting of Nuruddin Hassan Khan, and he took it to the Peshwa's Darbar and he showed it to them. And they were so impressed with it that the very same evening he got 3 or 4 people asking him to. Nana Fadnis gave him a commission for 2 paintings. Haripanta Phadke, who was another person there, he gave him a commission for painting. So he started getting work. And then you find him getting work to draw the paintings of the Peshwa, of Nana Fadnis, and so on. And then he gets special commission that I want you to draw a picture of the 3 of us sitting at one place. That is Mahatji Shinde and Nana Fadnis and Savai Madhavrao. Another with only Nana and Savai Madhavrao. And then he draws multiple sketches, the items which are supposed to be kept in front of these 2 people, how they should be arranged. So it's like creating a masterpiece from watercolors, taking them from approval to the Peshwa. And after getting the watercolors approved, he goes and so these are the components of the final picture which he draws. So here you find these are the ornaments which are supposed to be put in the Peshwa's ear and in his neck. And this is the sirpech which is supposed to be on his turban. These are the necklaces. So he draws these sketches. He mentions there what is the color of the diamond, what is the color of the emerald, and so on. This is a breastplate which he wears here. This is of course, the gulab dani for rose water, which again has got multiple rubies and diamonds studded here. This is a pan box for betel nuts, which again has got several diamonds studded on it, which was supposed to be kept in front of the picture. These 2 people were supposed to be standing behind the Peshwa. One is a Churi Bardar and one is the Peshwa's servant. And these 2 people you find he finally puts up in the picture when it is completed. And you can see the final picture on the right hand side, and these items have all been placed over here. And over here you can see the drafts of the swords which have been kept there of how the swords were. Then he's drawn another composition with the Peshwa having more people, one with the person sitting in the foreground and looking at him. And finally, this one selected was the one which you see on the right. The original painting of this one is about 7 feet high and about 5 feet across. And today it is in London in the Royal Asiatic Society at Euston. So anybody goes to London, I'm sure they'd like to have a look at this painting. It's a beautiful, larger than life size picture. So in this way, he kind of started making his mark in the Peshwa's Darbar. Now, there was always a certain mutual suspicion between the Marathas and the English. And when Robert Mebon, his assistant, was traveling from Bombay to Pune, you find suddenly and he had gone to Karla Caves and he was trying to draw sketches of Karla Caves. And he was measuring the length of the hall and so on. When the Jamadar, who was in charge of that place, he arrested him for being a spy. And the Killedar of the fort of Lohargarh confiscated all his drawing materials and his easel and so on. And he sent all the material to Nana Fadnis in Pune, asking for instructions what should be done about this spy. So this man was incarcerated there in the Karla caves for almost 30 days. And you have a separate diary of Robert Mebon describing what happened each day. And as he describes a fat Jamadar who used to come here, he spoke to me very nicely, but then he complained against me behind my back and so on. So that is another narrative you find he gives in his book, The Imprisonment of Robert Mebon. Then it was natural for him that after the monsoons got over, the festival season started, and the 2 main festivals that came up during his stay there were the Ganesh festival and Vijayadashmi. So in the Ganesh festival, he describes the Peshwa's Darbar. You find a rough sketch here of Ganesh over here. And he's given this key about who was sitting where. And the Peshwa was sitting here. And these people over here, the English people who sat sitting next to him, a lot of people are crowded around here. So he describes all the people who were present at that point in time. And then about a month later, when there's Vijayadashmi, he describes that 100,000 people were on the streets of Pune to celebrate that festival. And there were about 40 elephants, camels, horses. And this is a quick sketch drawn by Robert Mebon, a watercolor, of the Savai Madhavrao climbing onto the elephant. So you can see the elephant managed to sit down and he's climbing up the steps to get onto that. So these kind of paintings are also available of those days. So after festivals, he again came back to individual commissions which he kept getting. And one of the things he got was paintings of Nana Fadnis. We had multiple sittings with these people. And this final picture of Nana Fadnis, again, another masterpiece which you can see. Even the transparency of his clothes is depicted so beautifully. Now, this painting is, of course, in the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta. And that I got this picture from there. And similarly, he also drew a painting of Savai Madhavrao Peshwa. Now, this has gone to the Sangli Government Museum, and it's not very well maintained. I had to do a bit of Photoshop to get it cleaned up, but this is over there. So these kind of paintings he made at that time, and they were distributed along not only to the Peshwa and Nana, but many people ordered this painting. Now, this particular painting of Nana Fadnis, you find is so popular. If you go to Belbagh today, the Belbagh temple on Lakshmi Road, and you carefully look at the portraits that are put over there, you find a James Wales painting of a similar painting of Savai Madhavrao put up in the temple itself. So many people ordered copies and he kept making them. And there's a long list of people from noblemen whose paintings he drew at that time. Amongst them was Mahatji Shinde. Now Mahatji's painting was commissioned during his lifetime, but in 1794 after Mahatji died, this was eventually completed a little later. There's also another painting of Mahatji which he mentions of him sitting on a horse, which is a very, very unusual picture because you rarely have a picture of Mahatji sitting on a horse. So that painting of Wales I did not get, but I got another picture of Mahatji sitting on a horse, which is in the Jaipur Palace Museum. So I've just put it as a representative in the book to understand what that painting of James Wales might have looked like had it been available today for us. So he spent a lot of time doing this. Another masterpiece which he drew, but he could not complete, was the painting of, sorry, before that, there's another painting which I want to talk about, and that is the painting which is today discussed in the media about the famous painting available in the University of Pune, which has got damaged and which is hanging there for a very long time. Now, this painting is that of, it was titled The Maratha Empire. Now, the reason it was titled The Maratha Empire is because you have Mahatji Shinde, Savai Madhavrao and Nana Fadnis, all three of them sitting next to it. And this is the picture of the painting as it used to be in the university. Today, it is not available for public viewing because it has got damaged, and probably the archaeology department of the government of Maharashtra is engaged in getting it back in a shape where it can be exhibited. So this is a picture taken before that. And this actually painting was is not looking like a typical Wales painting because in 1879, when it was the governor of Bombay, somebody else had tried to restore it. And during the restoration, obviously some changes have taken place. But again, you find the same objects kept in front of the painting, which were there in the other one. Only the position of the people have been shifted around. And this was brought to Pune around 1930 because there was an exhibition which was held at the government building, which later on became the university. And a lot of paintings were lent by the governor of Bombay, when amongst them was this painting. And then it was left here after that in 1948. The University of Pune came up in the same premises, and it was there till about 10 years back in the vice chancellor's, outside the vice chancellor office. When the building was renovated, probably it was taken off, and in the interim period, something happened to it. So today you don't see it. So this is probably one of the few pictures you have of the painting as it existed before that. Now, besides this, one more painting which he made is probably the only glimpse you have of what buildings within the Shaniwar Wada, which was all burned down in 1828, might have looked like. So that painting you find is the Ganesh Mahal or the Ganesh Mahal of the Shaniwar Wada. Now, the story of this painting is that this was drawn in the form of sketches. Here you find a sketch on the left side, which was drawn by James Wales. And based on these sketches, which were, James Wales unfortunately could not finish this painting. He died before that. So these sketches were actually commissioned by Charles Mallet, because if you see in the picture, you find this man in the black coat is Sir Charles Mallet, and this Savai Madhavrao, this Nana Fadnis sitting next to him, and then other Maratha and English officers whose all these names are available, who are sitting here, and he's giving him a treaty in his hand. So this was Charles Mallet's moment of glory, which he wanted to commemorate in this painting. And he had signed the treaty with the Marathas to fight against Tipu Sultan in the middle of 1790. And that is when this it is an imaginary painting because James Whale was not in Pune at that time. Charles Mallet gave him the input. So you find everybody's on one side of the hall. One side of the hall is entirely empty. And that is how people are sitting, and the treaty has been signed and handed over to the Peshwa. And this painting was taken, the rough sketches were taken to England by Charles Mallet, and he got it completed by Thomas Daniel. The Daniel brothers were again, they were in Calcutta, though they visited Bombay for some time. They met Wales in Bombay also. When he went back, he used to go to London every day and tell Daniels how the painting is to be completed. So this was eventually completed by Daniel. Now the ceiling looks as if it is so high. Now the ceiling in Shanwarwada was never so high, but this is Daniel's addition to what Charles Mallet has drawn. So obviously there are some things which don't tally with the Ganesh Mahal as it existed at that time. It is shown far higher than what it was actually, and far wider than what it probably existed at that point in time. But you get an idea of what the final picture was like. And to get an idea of what the size of the painting actually is, you can see it's in Tate's Britain. And I had to take special permission to go in the vault to see it. But it's a huge painting. And all these scenes on the top, these are all scenes from the Dashavatar, which are there, right? From all these Dashavatar paintings are put up on the top. So that is what these paintings have been like. Now, the second part of Charles Mallet's passion, I would say. I mean, he did his paintings, he earned a lot of money from them. You find he mentions at different places, I got so many rupees for this, so many rupees for that, and so on. So he was making his fortune, but his real passion was actually the antiquities, as he calls the antiquities of the caves of India. And after visiting Kaneri and Jogeshwari and Mandapeshwar and Elephanta in Bombay, when he came down here, Charles Mallet was the first probably European to really visit Ellora, because Ellora was in the border of Nizams and the Maratha kingdom. So they had to take permission from both the powers to go there. And Charles Mallet was the first resident to actually visit Ellora and write an article about him around that time. And he encouraged James Wales that you must go to Ellora. So he traveled, another beautiful travelogue of Pune to Ellora and Ellora back to Pune, during which he describes all the villages on the way. He describes Ahmednagar, he describes Ranjangaon, and so many villages, what was happening there, how people used to dance for Vithoba's Ashadi Yatra, which was going on even at that time. He describes how the Pindaris used to come and loot villages because the war going on between the Nizam and the Marathas at that time in 1795. So all these descriptions are built into his travelogues. And then he goes to Ellora and he spends about 45 days over there, spending his time writing, documenting all those caves, writing the names of the caves as he understood at that point in time. Now, unfortunately, the understanding of those caves was not as correct as you have today. He could not distinguish that what his guide is telling him is actually a Buddhist cave. But in the Buddhist cave, the guide used to tell him that this is Ramchandra, this is Lakshman, this is Shiva. Well, actually, they were all Buddhist goddesses. So the Buddhist caves, Hindu caves, and the Jain caves are all mixed up. But he has named those caves as they exist at that point and documented what he saw there. He drew sketches of those paintings. He made paintings of those places. So those are all available with us, and they are quite a collection, I would say. Now, the first picture which he, in December 1792, when he was on his way to Bombay, he made a slight diversion at Karla, which he calls Equira, because the Equira's got a small temple outside the cave right from those days. And in the month of Paush, roughly corresponding to January, even today there is a big yatra which takes place there, the Equira Yatra, and it was taking place at that time also. Now, this archaeological sketch, which gives the length, the breadth, the height of, again, in the porch, that height. Now you see the three elephants which are there in that Karla caves, if you have visited there. These are the pillars, the stamba over there, which is height and diameter. Now, in those days, it was believed that this is not a Buddhist cave at all. In fact, this particular big Buddhist stupa which was there was considered a big shivling. And there were people who were worshipping it as a shivling in those days, and he describes it as such. But this importance of this drawing is that this is the first real sketch you have, the oldest archaeological sketch of a cave in India, which is you find from James Wales' journal, and it gives us date there, December 1792, on the road from Pune to Bombay. And how far distant I find excavation, which surprised to being stupendous work after. So he is very much impressed by these caves that he sees here. And he says he's seen nothing like it, the astonishing work. Everything is hyperbole. It's not something which is easily satisfied with. About Kailas and Krishneshwar, he reserves his highest praise, and in every place he goes, he tries to understand how the cave must have been excavated and what efforts were taken. Like in Kailas, he says this was probably the only cave which was one of the greatest antiquities he says he's ever witnessed. And he says that it is completely finished without scaffolding or ladders of any kind, as it was complete from the top to the bottom. So he goes into the details, the nitty-gritty of it. He describes the deities inside, what exactly is going on, what are the pillars like. There are pictures of pillars, what are the figures on the pillars. All those have been documented of those days. So he's got a lot of things which are written about Ellora, which would be important to the archaeologists of today also. From here he describes caves of Pune, like this is the Pataleshwar cave, which you find a lot of water collected here. And you can see the two lions over here at the entrance to Pataleshwar, which he describes. Now today these lions are not existing because the water which used to fall from the top used to fall exactly on these lions, and they got so badly worn out that a few years back, it seems, I think just a paws were left, and finally the ASI has kind of just cemented it over. And today you find that this is a place where you can sit on those side of the two steps, the cement platform. But these two lions you find in this picture, which he has described at the entrance. Similar lions were there at Mandapeshwar, which have also almost completely worn out. You can just identify the paw of a lion, which is still in existence at that point in time. So these records are there. Like Elephanta, this is a picture of Elephanta which shows this elephant. Now this elephant is the actually from where this name Elephanta has come. But the elephant today is no longer in the Elephanta caves. It is outside Bhau Daji Lad Museum in the Jijamata Udyan in Bombay, because it was shifted from there to, in fact, the English wanted to take it to England. But when they tried to dig it out of the sand and with something with ropes and so on, it started breaking up into pieces. So all they could do is shift it to Bombay, rejoin it, and today you find it standing in the outside the Bhau Daji Lad Museum in the Victoria Gardens. This again is a painting of the Elephanta caves. You can find these pillars are incomplete because the erosion by water, these pillars had all been destroyed. The second part of Elephanta is that these pillars are there, but the pillars are not actually holding the weight of the rock on top. These pillars are purely ornamental. Now today these pillars have all been completed, and you find complete pillars all over the place, but they have been redone later on. And this picture has been drawn by him with his back towards the Trimurti of the Elephanta caves and looking away from there. And he also writes at one place, there is a hollow space behind that image of Sadashiv, because Sadashiv is supposed to have four heads. So he said there's a hollow space behind it, which today I don't think anybody can really venture to go on top and see whether there's a hollow space behind it. But he describes it in his diary. So this is the kind of information about his caves that you get. And the next thing you find is he goes in 1795 to Bombay, having finished his work in Pune, and visiting the Kaneri and Pataleshwar caves, you find that he has contracted a fever, and during that fever he stays with that fever for 8 days, and he dies after that at somewhere in Thana. And today if you go to St. Thomas Cathedral in Fort, which is just near Asiatic Library, you'll find a marble plaque on the wall which has been put up by his daughter, that James Wales died on so and so date, and so on and so forth. And in fact, Bharat Gotoskar has even found a register on St. Thomas Cathedral where there's a mention of the day James Wales died in that 18th century register. His daughter, actually, Elizabeth, became the second wife of Charles Mallet. She was much younger than him, and Charles Mallet actually had an Indian wife. Again, that Indian wife was supposedly a Rajput princess, and I haven't put it in the slideshow, but she was a very beautiful lady. It's an extremely beautiful painting which James Whale did of her, but I think I must leave something for you to admire from the book. So I'm not putting it on the slideshow. But the picture is not only showing her in face, but all the ornaments of that time, which were worn by the ladies. All those ornaments were there. Now, Charles Mallet went to England with Elizabeth Wales, left his Indian wife behind. He had children from her who also went to England later on. So, to sum up, what I'll say is that we are nearing the last slide. So, to sum up, what I'll say is that here was a man who came here to witness the last years of pre-colonial self-governing India. And over the next 100 years, you find India's natural course of a country changed. And from a world in itself, it became a nation engaged in a globalized planet. And so this actually gives you a view of what the late 18th century Western India really looked like. You know, in their entire 150 years of rule, the Marathas have not left behind any exquisite buildings like you have in Delhi, or any objects they art like the Mughals did. Their rugged forts and their wooden palaces, which burned down later, are all that they got. And and actually, it was very late in the 18th century when the artistic renaissance was coming in the Maratha period. And there are these few original pictures survived to tell us the story of those times. They patronized artists also, like in addition to James Wales and Robert Mebon, we had Gangaram. Then we had Rajasthani artists who came down to Pune, like Bhojraj. Today, if you enter the Shanwarwada, at the ticketing counter, when you turn right and look behind at the wall, you'll find two beautiful fading pictures of a Ganpati with Riddhi Siddhi on two sides, and you find another painting below of Sheshashai Vishnu, which are rapidly disappearing because of pollution and whatever. I mean, there is a lot of fungus probably on that, which require urgent cleaning up to maintain those. And those are one of the biggest wall paintings we have of that period, of that Maratha art period, as you call it. And this is some kind of last flicker of cultural renaissance which you find that was there in that time, and which is partly captured by the work of James Wales. And it is not that the Marathas were not aware, like you find Nana Fadnis writing letters to his Vakil in Delhi, saying that please find Nidhamal. Where is Nidhamal? Please ask him to draw a Krishna portrait for me. Now, by that time, Nidhamal had already left Delhi and gone to Lucknow, because Delhi was no longer the place where even artists could thrive, because there was no royalty left there. There was Maratha artists like Sabaji Anand. There are pictures of Savai Madhavrao drawn by Sabaji Anand in the Raja Kelkar Museum. So all these people were there, and their compositions finally give you a picture of what the Maratha period of that time. It gives you a glimpse into the late 18th century. And that is what I would say is the ultimate purpose of having made this book. Thank you everybody for this patient listening, and we are open to questions.
Are you unsure?
Why don't you? That's it.
Thank you.
Okay. Unmute yourself and ask questions, please.
I think let the moderator decide who's going to ask.
Let them. They will ask questions, and I will.
I was just wondering, Uday, I mean, he starts with sketches, then there are some watercolors, and there are oils. So are they mainly oils? Are the watercolors to be seen as sort of intermediate efforts?
Most of the intermediate drafts made before the final oil painting was done. And most of the intermediate drafts of oil paints have been drawn by either Robert Mebon or Gangaram Tambat. But the oils are all James Wales. And then there are again sketches which he draws in his journals, which are again James Wales. So very few watercolors are drawn by James Wales, because he uses assistants to give him inputs of what he wants to portray. And then finally, building on those watercolors, he makes the final oil, which goes on probably 15-20 days at a time when he's making the oil for somebody.
Okay.
That's how the process of working he was following.
Right.
I think, Mukul, you have some questions.
Yeah. I have a question. Dr. Kulkarni, actually, you've answered a lot of things. I had wanted to ask how that crossing the boat at the Sangam was, what were those? I thought that they were You have told us that they were dried pumpkins, things like that. I thought it's something else actually. So it was very strange for me to see such a kind of crossing. And thank you so much, because you've given us a very good social history through these pictures to back up the political history that we already know. I have a question, which is there must have been many more. So what criteria did you use to make this selection ABCD and not XYZ? I mean, how did you?
I had a choice of too many pictures actually. I was
That's what I meant.
spoiled for choice. So what I had to select was the pictures which are going with the text in his book, in his journal. So I tried to match the pictures for which I have some description in his journals. So otherwise, it's like, just putting up some picture which has got no relevance with the story. So I had to partly select from that point of view. And that was one criteria for doing this kind of.
Yeah. Right. I would have liked a description if he had somewhere of how the British sat on the floor, because given their clothes, it must have been so difficult. So it would have been good to read.
It was difficult. And the second part of the story, it was not just sitting on the floor. They had to also make sure that their heels are not turned towards the.
Yes.
And Charles Mallet was very fussy about these things, because, and depending on the power with whom you are dealing, like there are a lot of original documents of Charles Mallet available, which I have not had opportunity to use so far. But when he was the resident at the Nawab of Kambayat, for example, Nawab of Cambay was not a very powerful person. So he said, I'm not going to take off my shoes over there. But when he came to Pune, he used to properly take off his shoes and sit with his legs folded backwards on his haunches, so that the sole of the foot is not pointed towards the Peshwa. So kind of compromises they had to make.
Yeah. And there was one more thing I learned from the pictures, was that I thought only those among the Brahmins went sati. But there was this lady from the tailor caste, he says. So I didn't know that. And that was some knowledge for me. And that wearing of the yellow color, that also
that
was.
is a picture which is in the book.
I meant that.
That was drawn by his daughter. Probably it was one of the ladies of the residency who were going sati, and they had to wear that. Probably applied all over their body. I don't know, something of that.
I never knew, and I also didn't know that children and everybody came along. That was also knowledge for me. Yeah, but thank you very much. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yes, can I, my observations?
Who's this?
Neelam.
Hi, Neelam. Go on.
Hi. Okay. I've learned a lot about done so much of studying in history, but what we learned, his attention to detail, James Wales, is very nice. I think so. So small things like what this lady just mentioned about kids coming and everybody coming is like one event, the Sati event.
Yes.
And small details like where people were sitting. I think it was amazing. And our familiarity with Bombay and Pune. So it was like you were taking us through the whole journey of how did James Wales come from Bombay to Pune and where he went. I think it was
his trip to Ellora is even more fascinating, with all the small places you can identify. And if you go there, you might be able to see those temples. Like he goes to Ranjangaon's Ganpati temple.
Yes.
He describes that, the fields there, the streams there, bats hanging from the trees. So small details you learn of what kind of.
Such a pity Ellora Ajanta is so badly maintained. That's
another point he makes about Ellora is that he says the Kailash temple, because it was chiseled out from stone and it was a Shiva temple, that was the original Krishneshwar. And the present Jyotirlinga of Krishneshwar, which is right opposite Ellora caves, has come in Ahilya Devi Holkar's time. So, but this Kailash was the original Krishneshwar, is what Wales writes at that point in time.
We used to go for school picnics to Ajanta, Ellora, not Ellora, Elephanta Caves. Kaneni
Yeah, may
Cave.
I ask a question? Sorry.
Latika?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kulkarni. I would like to ask you that this journal that James Wales maintained, where he both described what he saw and did the sketches and so on, did he just describe, or did he also write about his reactions? For instance, Sati, for instance. Now, is it just a description of what he saw or how he felt about it? If he saw a certain temple in Ellora, was just a description of the temple or his reaction to the temple?
He writes about his impressions very much so. I mean, whether it's the villagers, he thinks they are too conceited, they think no end of themselves. He writes his comments. I mean,
Okay.
whether it's about Ellora, he says it's one of the most magnificent
Yeah.
things I've ever seen. Or
In the world.
About Sati, he says, what a horrifying thing to see.
Horrifying practice. Yeah.
Things he does mention in his diary. And I've not taken all the things that he wrote there because it's a date-wise thing. It would have been very monotonous to take each and every part that he wrote. But I have kind of edited out some portions, taken the more relevant ones, which would be of interest to the reader, and tried to include those in the book. But I think he's very observant, and he's not I wouldn't say he's a parochial person. He's looking at it from an outsider coming to India and exposed to the Orient for the first time, and the shock, the dismay, the surprise, the pleasant things that he sees. He's equally gracious when he
Yeah,
sees
yeah.
something else. So he's quite unbiased about what he describes that way.
Yeah. Mhm.
Anyone else? I wanted to, Farooq, go ahead. After
Yeah.
you, Farooq, I will have a
Yeah,
question.
yeah. So, Uday, I wanted to know how were you able to read those letters and the language, especially I heard that there is something called the Modi script or the Marathi thing. How have you crossed that barrier of understanding the scripts?
In this particular book, there was no Modi script. That is in
Yeah,
different.
but in your other books, you have written about the correspondence between Nana and with the Panipat War and all those letters.
Yeah.
How did you read those and how did you
No,
decipher those?
some of the letters I got them from Royal Asiatic, those 200 papers which I got from there in 2013. And I didn't know Modi at that point in time. But there was a historian, Pune, Mr. Ninad Bedekar.
Yes,
I
yes.
sat next to him, and while reading those 200 papers with him, I learned Modi actually. It was the process
Wow.
of transliteration from Modi into Devanagari by which I learned Modi. But again, Modi is something which you have to keep practicing. You can't just do it 2 years and then forget about it. It has
Is
to
it
be
like a Hindi Marathi or what it is? Is it like Hindi Marathi or it is a combination of
No, it's a running hand. It's a running hand Marathi. There are some letters which even resemble Gujarati and some resemble Marathi. Some are written in a completely different style. But every writer has got his own style. So unless you read the first 5 pages of a document, you don't really get the hang of what this guy's style is. So some people write in a different way, and then you have to see the words next to it, next to that, try to frame a sentence, and then assume, oh, this is the letter he's trying to make. So you can't read more than 5 or 6 Modi papers in a day. When you try to translate it, then it's exhausting to do it. There are people who do it on a daily basis. They are much more fluent, but you can't spend so much time on it. So
I have one more question, Uday, for you. Why the fascination for the 18th century and why the Maratha Empire? Why did you choose this subject and the century?
there are 2-3 reasons for that. For one, I found that 18th century was the most ignored portion of our history. And the second thing is that we have placed a lot of reliance on colonial historians or Indian historians who worked in the colonial period, who had their own motivations and own axe to grind. So you find there's a lot of emphasis given that the Mughals ruled till 1857 or at least till 1757, and 1757 Battle of Plassey, suddenly the British Empire began. And that is what we learn, even what we kind of gather from whatever textbooks we read in our books now. And this Maratha interlude which existed is kind of just brushed under the carpet. So that was one motivation for setting the record right. That was one motivation for doing that. And I was right from the beginning determined that it has to be an unbiased record. So I have to depend on primary sources and original letters as far as possible. Only where I don't get letters, I go to personal narratives and pakhars and so on. So that was the way it all started. I never knew I'm going to be in this 10 years down the line when I began. So that way I've come a long way, I would say.
Actually, I must say, Uday, is that we went through the whole school education. I've seen the BA courses of history and MA courses of history. Nobody mentions Maratha Empire and the glory which you have shown.
Yes. In fact, you're from my batch, so you remember our history book was, I think, edited by Mr. D.C. Paute, and he starts with Arcot and Clive and Dupleix.
Yeah.
So that was a history which then the Regulating Act and those kind of, it was a totally anglicized version of Indian history which you were being taught right up to the 60s. So we didn't know better. I mean, there's no way that we could really explore these things. So that was education policy.
One question I have, Uday, and I'm very curious about it, is that during the 1790s, that decade, the residency guy was sitting in Pune. He was taken a good care and everything was given respect, and the Maratha and all. Why did the Maratha Empire lost in 1818? You know, would you be speaking about it in your coming books? We are very anxious to know. Will you go up to 1818 because that's the next century?
It's a really long way off from where I am right now. I'm right now writing on the period after Panipat. That is the Madhavrao Peshwa years, 12 years after Panipat. But because as you go further in the 18th century, the number of resources available to you and the number of, because you have English resources, you have Marathi resources, and they keep increasing. So, you know, like last book I wrote, Nana Sahib Peshwa, 21 years.
Yeah.
But same size book now I'll be writing on Madhavrao, which will cover just a decade. Because the sources are increasing as you go further down the road. And if you want to really represent what actually happened in India as a whole, and not just talk about one corner of the country or what one Darbar was doing. Because if you don't understand that in 1763, when there's a battle going on near Aurangabad between the Nizam and the Marathas, there was a battle going on near Buxar, which gave the Diwani of Bengal to the English.
Yes.
So, you know, you have to put things in context, for which I have to give the background of what happened after Clive took over. Why did the English manage to be in a position that they won Buxar, and how did it change the eastern complexion of Eastern India? How did they gain political power? So unless you know what's happening in the rest of the country, you can't put this in a proper perspective. So it's, you know, always difficult to, but I mean, every empire has got a shelf life. So, you know, if anybody feels that this should go on forever, it can never happen.
Anyone else? I had a question there. You know, there was somewhere or the other that mentioned that he sold a set of engraved prints called the 12 Reviews of Bombay for 350 rupees. 350 rupees, that time must have been tremendously costly.
Yes. And
are those...
before he makes the views, there is something called a subscription list. If you see old 18th century books, in the beginning of the book, there is a subscription list. So before the book is published, he's already got subscribers who are going to buy it. He's got an assured number, 100, 200 people who are going to order the book when it is ready. And he had a grand project of making a book of all the antiquities of India, which he found, which he thought will have a huge market in England. And in fact, there are letters which he discusses with Charles Mallet. When I complete the book, at what price should it be sold? Should it be £7? Should it be £10? So that kind of discussion is also going on. Unfortunately, he's a short illness and he dies in 1795. So you really don't know what he would have done had he survived. And then Mallet went back to England 2 years later, and whatever was left was completed by Daniel.
But is it possible that, you know, prints of those can be made and given around? Anywhere you go about any part of the world, they will have photos, statues, etc. of their historical figure. And the historical figure may be only about 150, 200 years back. Why can't we have something about this 12 Views of Bombay?
No,
why can't the print be available for sell it to Pune people?
No, they are available. They are available on the internet if you really make a search for them.
Okay.
And high resolution prints are available. There's a SP Lohia Books who have got them. Then there's an institute in Poland actually. From where I got some pictures. The British Library has got some. Of course, British Library charges the earth for getting a picture from them. So you had to depend on people from Poland who are only too happy to part with them. Otherwise, one picture from the British Library you want to get, you have to pay 25, 30 pounds. So that's really not possible for a book of this size to spend for.
No, I'm not talking about the book, but prints of that. can they be made and
They are
sold as a
available.
set?
Yes, they are
Say,
available.
8,000, 10,000 rupees for a set of these prints? Because this is if you look at the prints, etc., they are very exciting. I feel that they should be seen more than
They're easily available even without paying too much money, and you can blow them up to any size you want, because if you get a high resolution image, you can do it. It won't cost that much.
There's a guy called Sujit Patwar, and maybe he can get us those prints and sell them.
No,
He's saying no,
I told you last year in Bombay, there's a man called Bharat Gotoskar.
Okay,
He's got a place called Khaki Labs, just opposite the old custom house.
okay,
He is heavily into Bombay's heritage.
okay.
So he made a special effort. In fact, I had given a talk there last January about James Wales, where he made a special effort to send a man to these 12 views and get pictures of them as they stand today. And he put all those 12 pictures of James Wales' picture, the present day view of Bombay. And we had a lecture with those 12 pictures all around the hall.
Wow.
We've already done that exercise.
Okay, so someone has done it,
Yes,
but again, it should come out. It should be sold really also well. Of Pune, is there a set like that of Pune?
There are a few books on Pune of 18th. A lot of pictures are available of 18th century. In fact, the British Library has got about 150 pictures of Pune. And I'd gone there to once and spoken to the curator. I told him, why don't you loan us these copies of these pictures? We'll put them in Pune for the people of Pune to see. So he said, no, sir, we are not able to give these like this. There are a lot of formalities, and we are not allowed.
Formalities, etc. So I think the government has to be pushed from one side to the other.
The initiative, exactly.
Okay. Now, I was watching something on Leonardo saying Da Vinci's thing on Netflix, and there he is arrested for stealing paints. Now, I noticed something. Now, this is Da Vinci was way back. His paint, that means about 200 years before. But the paint, the pigments, etc., do not seem to be as wide a range as you see nowadays. Is there any reason why? Because when you see, there's not much colorfulness in there.
No, India had some of its own pictures, like indigo and some other pictures which are described here. He has described one spot, which are the paints available here and how we can get them. I'll have to look up the page now. But he has described at one spot which are the paints available in India. He's made a list of them. Then he used to even see which are the paints which can be used, how we can improvise for what is not available. So all these things he has written. He has also written from where he used to get frames, because he used to be very particular how the picture is framed. So there are mentions of his importing frames from China in those days. Many of these frames which you see today, and they are original, they have been acquired from all the way from China with the British ships, East India Company ships which used to come here. He used to place an order and get them here. So like he's made up on page 28, he's mentioned about discovered ultramarine, another color, greenstone burnt, and also white ochre. So these paints discovered after coming here. Then which I found here for sale, real ultramarine, called by the natives a lossy word, greenstone, native cinnabar, orpiment, yellow ochre, black made from coconut shell, Indian pride, gold red, Regan, wood oil, poppy oil. So these are the things which he found here. And what he couldn't find here is to tell people, he had people in England who used to write to, that please get me this here. He used to also do a bit of trading on the side. Like there was a lot of fascination with watches and clocks in India. So he used to tell somebody in England that please send me so many watches. They must be made of silver cases. They must have something inscribed on them that they are manufactured in London. The manufacturer's name should be on them. You can even send people who repair watches, because there's a lot of fascination with watches over here among the nobility. So he also tries to do something of that sort to earn some extra money.
Okay. So he was a businessman completely.
No, not a businessman actually. He had come here to make his fortune. So I mean, you can't blame him.
You can't blame him at all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dr.
Anyone
Kulkarni,
else?
Yeah, one last question, small question.
Yes.
May I ask?
Please.
Latika. Dr. Kulkarni, is James Wales known in England?
Yes.
Is he
Aberdeen at a place called Peterhead in Aberdeen.
He's known there as an artist and a historian.
Some of his paintings which he made before coming here are available in the Edinburgh, one of the museums there. I mentioned in my book, but bulk of his work was done here, and they are distributed all over the place, from Calcutta to Nagpur to Sangli to Pune to London to New York, Yale, all these all over the world. So you have to get them from various places to put them together.
Okay. Any other?
Satish, can I say something?
Who?
Anna,
Anna. Okay. Anna, I can't see who.
Anna,
Go ahead,
one
Anna.
second. I'll try and put my camera on. Yeah.
Doesn't. Okay. Got you.
Yeah. Okay. So I only want to say that, following that, the gentleman mentioned that the wall paintings in Shaniwar Wada are being rapidly disintegrating. So if you follow the Parthenon marbles and various other issues that are happening, where previously colonized places are asking the British to return their treasure, and the British are saying, you guys, I mean, just putting it simply, won't be able to look after it. So I think, isn't it wonderful if we would protect what we already have? Like twice, he mentioned twice, the author mentioned twice, the paintings in Pune University and Shaniwar Wada wall paintings. So isn't that actually where we should start? Preserve what we have before adding to
Actually,
it.
we have started working on them. Just last month, we had gone Mr.
Uday, you can't be heard clearly.
Muhtar Tidak, who was the MLA in that area, we had a visit of that place, and there's a plan and a proposal being made to conserve those wall paintings. Unfortunately, the air won't allow the painting to be directly worked. You can make clean it, but not.
You're
redo
not
them,
very clear.
like putting fresh
You're not
paint on
very
the
clear.
existing paint. You can't redo those paintings. You can clean them and but you cannot redo those paintings. You cannot repaint them over, make them what they were. Because this thing destroying history, that's what the rules say.
Okay.
We are working on that project. And the project is on afoot actually.
Oh, that's
I
good
think
to hear.
there are two more people asking questions.
Yeah.
One is Satish Dovrekar. Satish, go ahead. And after that, Farooq is there.
I have a question. When did actually there were Joshi brothers in Pune who wanted to change Mori to Devanagari, correct? So this
Yeah.
was a movement that started in Pune and their plan was that all states across India should adopt Devanagari as a unifying script. So at what point did Modi change into Devanagari in Maharashtra?
Can't hear you at all.
You not hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Don't worry.
So at what point in time did Modi change to Devanagari? Because I know there was a movement by Joshi brothers who wanted to change scripts all across India into Devanagari.
Actually, the government around about 100 years back took a policy to write Marathi in Devanagari and not in Modi. Because there was a man called Charles Kincaid over here who has mentioned this in one of his books, that it was decided that Modi should be given up and Devanagari should be used as the script for writing Marathi. Because Modi is difficult to read. So people of that generation did it. There are a lot of grammatical things which are not, the spellings, for example, in Modi. The Raswa and Dirgha which you got in Marathi are not always followed in Modi. So today Devanagari, if you see the spellings and the grammar, it is much more, I would say more correct than what the Modi writing was.
Okay, but I have also...
Modi is being encouraged, people are learning Modi, because otherwise if you don't read Modi and learn Modi, you cannot read all those 3.9 crore documents lying in the Pune archives. You need people who know Modi to read them. So that is why there's a movement people are taking classes to teach Modi to people so that they learn it. But there's no way we can replace Devanagari back and go back to Modi. That is not.
No, I'm not saying that we go back to, I'm saying, was there, I don't know if, is this true, that there were Joshi brothers in Pune who wanted entire India to adopt Devanagari as a unifying script.
No,
You
I have
heard
no
of-
idea. I have no idea.
Because
I haven't
I've-
heard
I-
about that.
because I've read about it in several history books. So I
Yeah,
just wanted to know if you come across this
Yeah, I mean, it's a good idea to, at least if you can't have a national language, have a national script.
script, because this was done in China by Ming Dynasty.
Okay.
Because in China, even in China, different provinces don't understand each other, but they got unified through a common script,
Yes,
which was implemented by the Ming Dynasty.
that's a good.
I like the way we are. Sorry, but I like the way we are. I would rather have everyone has a different language, etc. is good, and then that's how you can get together.
You are not
Farooq-
going to remove the languages.
Yeah.
You are only unifying the script. Okay.
Farooq,
So
Yeah, I
people can
think-
read each other. Okay. So
Yeah, I think so maybe this is the last question. I leave it to Mike.
yes.
But what next, Uday? What can we expect? I've read all your books. I want to know what's
Okay,
next.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I'm writing on this Madhavrao Peshwa period now.
Okay.
I try not to make it a biography as far as possible. Because if you write a biography, you somehow they fall in love with the hero, which I don't want to do. So, I mean, everybody's a human being and one should not put anybody on a pedestal. That is my general.
So it will be the last will be 1999, 1799 Tipu Sultan will
I
end the
don't know
book.
whether I don't know whether I have the stamina to go that far. So I'm just looking up to 1772. Because
Okay.
even the thought of going beyond 1772 is so daunting.
Uh-huh.
Because the first Anglo-Maratha war starts.
Uh-huh.
It's so complex, and there are so many things happening at that time. That I mean, I'll say it's daunting for the reader to really put all those strings together and come to understand a cohesive narrative what I'm trying to put across. It's a challenge for the author, but it's an even greater challenge for the reader to really comprehend what is going on.
Yes.
It's very complex.
Okay. I think that's the last of the questions. Uday, 3 cheers to you. You have done such a marvelous work. I always enjoyed your talks because they're full of information. I think it's wonderful. Where do you find the time to do it? I'm amazed at how we do it. And the paintings, etc. I had the book. Farooq refused to give it to us more than 3-4 days. Yeah. हम पकड़ के रखे 5 दिन में हम देख
क्या
लेते मोहिनी
क्या
and I.
झूठ क्या झूठ बात कर रहे हैं यार सतीश? क्या झूठ बात कर रहे हैं?
So, Moini and I were sharing it.
Farooq, I agree with you. It's not a book to be borrowed. Everybody should buy it.
अरे I know, but because Satish and Moini stay next to me, तो मैंने भेजा उन लोगों को. मेरे पास एक ही बुक था. अभी मुझे मालूम नहीं था कि मुझे 2 बुक भेजने थे.
Today तो हमारा झगड़ा कब होता था. Anyway, that was very good. We enjoyed it thoroughly. And
Thank you.
I'll again ask you, your next book when it comes, schedule a hearing with us immediately. Give me a month.
Actually, this is going to be my last talk till the next book comes.
Yeah,
Because
please.
Every talk I give, I have to spend 2 days to prepare for it. So now I'm not going to take any more talks till the book is ready. That's what I have to say.
And that time, please let us know. Within a month of your publication, we'll be able to have a reading of it down here.
We'll be your subscribers.
We will subscribe to that. Yes, we will subscribe to that also. Thank you very much, etc. I just wanted to tell you about what all programs we have now for the coming 1 minute. Moini is busy with something or the
Yes.
other.
No, next
You're there.
Sunday.
You're back. Come
Of
on.
course I'm here. Where would I be?
Okay. Where are you?
Next Sunday, we have Latika Padgaonkar presenting a book by Justin Marosi, another history book. So it's called Tamerlane, Sword of Islam, Conqueror of the World. So that is what we're going to hear about on the 16th of May. Then 23rd of May, we have Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, presented by Prashant Sinha. And Uday, thank you so much. We very much realize, how much hard work, research. I mean, you have shown tremendous stamina in putting the book together, and I can imagine how much work.
I agree with you there. So it does.
Yes.
does require
And I
it.
can imagine how much work is going into your next book also.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay,
So
bye.
thank you.
It also
Uday,
takes a lot of
thanks a lot.
stamina for the reader to read his books also.
I know.
Yes.
Just to remember the things, the way you say it.
Yes, yes.
Well,
So- Thanks for
All the
hearing.
very best to you guys. Thank you. And we'll see you next Sunday. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.